Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Dune Spice Wars. This will likely be one of the last reflective pieces I do on the early access release, but I think this is a very important one. And seeing as we've had, luckily, some developers and some attention from Shiro Games on the channel, I feel like this could also be a good opportunity for us to discuss collectively what we like to think about the 5 things that Dune must do, forgive the pun, as it moves through its early access and really focusing on how it can hold on to what has been a very successful early access launch. My name is JumboPixel, and without any further ado, let's jump straight in. Firstly, I think that multiplayer is a must, and obviously this is already happening, right? It's no secret that they will be adding multiplayer to this game. They have all but confirmed it. Hopefully we'll see it during the early access. I think that multiplayer for a Dune Spice Wars will really set this game apart from the rest. Hopefully, though, with a few caveats. I'm not just going to say, hey, we need multiplayer and leave it at that. I think there's a little bit more detail that needs to be unpacked. Firstly, I think that a multiplayer version of Dune Spice Wars would likely want or need to have an alternative rule set, at least available as an option. An alternative rule set that perhaps sped up the game, the overall pacing of the game. Maybe that's a simple adjustment like the in-game speed, moving at a faster pace, or maybe that's to do with the overall yield earn. A normal game of Dune Spice Wars can take around 2 to 4 hours, depending on who you're playing and how you're playing and how long you spend paused, I suppose. But I think that a multiplayer rule set needs to be enacted as well, at least as an option. So it's not just as simple as enabling multiplayer, but actually supporting it through development. Further along from that, I think maybe we could also use different multiplayer formats, perhaps a competitive multiplayer setting versus a casual one. I'd really love to play some multiplayer with you and subscribers, but I also know that there could potentially be a more competitive scene emerge around Dune Spice Wars if it plays its cards right. Speaking of playing its cards right, of course, it's important to note before I move on to my next point, just to really stress and reiterate, this is an early access release. This is early access feedback. But my goodness, so far, so good. Speaking of so far, so good, I think the next point that they probably need to address, and this is one that comes through more in the negative reviews, more Dune lore. Dune Spice Wars is obviously set on Arrakis, a very dangerous planet, home to that glorious sweet, sweet spice. And with that comes a deep lore in the world. Many argue, not all, but many argue that this game could use a bit more of that lore. So it got me thinking, how and why? Firstly, I think we could use some sort of setup. The kind of, why am I here? If you're familiar with Dune already, you already know that. If you're not, it could be useful. This could come in the form of a cutscene added to the start of a game that very briefly describes the setting. It could be to do with storytelling, and that storytelling could be told through narration in-game as well. Currently, in this early access state, there's relatively little in the way of narration, both from an overall sort of second-party, third-party narrator narrating the game settings, but also down at the sort of individual house level. You can engage diplomatically with other houses, but there's really little lore building involved in that. Which kind of sort of brings me through into the third subpoint here. I think that Dune Spice Wars could benefit more from diplomatic spats, from diplomatic misdemeanors. Currently, the engagement with the AI players is very, very limited. You can't really push a whole load of demands on them. The treaty system is nice, but I think there's probably more work that could be done there. And overall, I think as well on the overall design of the AI and the design of the factions, they could benefit from having more quotes. Probably their own unique voice lines as well would really help benefit to add in that lore and to add in more storytelling into Dune Spice Wars. And then lastly, I think to help build that world, probably more involvement of the soundtrack, the score could be used. I actually quite like the score that's already in the game. It's simple, it's effective, but maybe we could have unique scores and soundtracks more for different factions and houses as they emerge as well. And overall, I think to round this section out, and what many people have said, what about a story-driven campaign? We have this, what I would call more sandbox mode, right? It's you just jump in, you play a game. Maybe there could be a better utilized single-player story-driven campaign mode as well. I think that would be very enjoyable, and I think that the players would like that. The question is, will it fit within an early access? Will it fit within a broader release? And does it fit with what Dune Spice Wars and what Shiro Games are trying to achieve? I think it probably does, and I think that we can probably look to their previous experience with, in particular, Northguard, a game that I have relatively limited experience myself with, but as I understand it, has been a very well-supported, very well-developed. In fact, it continues to be. It just had a massive update the other day. So I think that that's a good sign moving forward for these story-driven lore elements of Dune, and I think that, really, we could probably use a few more of them. Moving along, my next setting, my next recommendation here for what Dune must do is another one that I think a lot of you will agree with. It's more factions in the game. Now, of course, this is an obvious one, right? It's early access. Of course, there are going to be more factions. And yeah, you're absolutely right. In fact, I'm pleased to say that they have previously confirmed to us that there will at least be one more added during the early access period. We don't know quite how long that will last either, so maybe a little bit more information out of them as a bonus tip here would be really nice. But on the factions thing, I have a few specific ideas, not for necessarily specific ones that should be brought from the books or the films. I know many of you can fill that blank for me, but actually what they should do. I think that we could potentially have the addition of more counselors as well to both the existing factions and any future ones added. That adds a whole wealth of replayability, and it can really change the design of a house as well, depending on the counselors and their abilities. So that's a really quick, or a slightly quicker, easier win. And then moving through, I think we could potentially see more units, maybe vehicles, although I know that they don't go down so well with the worms. However, I've also heard many people say that previous Dune games have had them, so why can't these, that they feature in the books or what have you. So I think there's room potentially to expand there. And then finally, also, I think that maybe there's potentially a playstyle gap at the moment around the more sneaky operation assassination style to win the game. This is maybe not the biggest deal, but I did want to put it at the end here on the more factions thing because I think that we could use a faction that really loves to go down that assassination route of domination instead of the troop-based capital destroying route. Something to think about, maybe. Food for thought. Speaking of food for thought, my next recommendation is more specific to the game itself. In fact, both of these last two ones are. I'm looking really specifically at gameplay, or maybe UI, or how the overall game is balanced or boosted. And actually, that's my next point. Balance and boosting. So, in Dune Spice Wars, I think there are a few early access combinations, balances, etc. that are broken. These will be easily fixed. It's part of the early access journey, I'm sure, but I think it's important that we discuss them now to understand them and maybe future-proof ourselves. I have 3 points. Firstly, the tech and development trees likely need a rework. The way that you earn knowledge is a little bit unusual, but I actually quite like it. I think that that system itself is fine, but there are definitely development trees that are incredibly overpowered. The Fremen can burst through it like a 40% bonus at least. Back that up with extra knowledge. You can either get stuck just being completely dead in the water if you don't prioritize it, or if you're playing certain factions, you can just smash through and complete it. So maybe some tuning around there. Furthermore, maybe tuning around that home base bazaar. A few of the home base improvements I think could use some tweaks and changes. Also potentially around their costings as well. It would be interesting to see different home base improvements have more unique costings in terms of the resources that they require, or even resources required to keep them, to upkeep them. Maybe there's water upkeep available for certain factions and not others. Things like that I think we could play on a bit more that we aren't already necessarily making the most of in Dune Spice Wars. And then lastly, I think the operations are very fun, but maybe their cooldowns need to be adjusted a little bit as well. The one that springs to mind immediately is, of course, the ceasefire poison reserve combination. A combination that not only fits fairly well under the maybe needs to be looked at under the balance microscope lens, but also, I think, under this sort of boosted cooldown lens as well. The cooldown is too soon. You can just use it on repeat. Now, the really juicy thing there, though, is that we also constantly have to keep in the back of our minds that if we'd like this to be a multiplayer experience, and if we'd like this to be an enjoyable multiplayer experience, then we also need to consider what the impacts are on multiplayer from making changes like this. If multiplayer doesn't have its own rule set, like I think it could benefit from having, then all of these changes have to be factored in at least a little bit with multiplayer in mind. Balancing a multiplayer, though, not going to happen because human beings are awesome. And really true balancing in any 4X or real-time strategy game should never completely happen, I don't think, because if everything is perfectly balanced, nothing is. And also, you don't want everything to end up being too samey. My final point is one specifically about the actual gameplay itself. When I'm playing Dune Spice Wars in the nitty-gritty, in the weeds and the detail, what needs to be adjusted? There are actually only a few things, and I should just reiterate this again in case you're new here or you haven't seen any of my other Dune Spice Wars coverage. I think that this is a very good early access release. I've very much enjoyed it, a bit more than I thought I was going to be completely honest, and I think that it's likely going to be a very promising title, so long as they can hold the momentum and continue to push. A few things. I think this last point can really be summarized as ditching the clutter. The alerts up in the top left are great, but they stack in a very odd way. You can receive 3 alerts for the same fight, although the same one can come up again and again. They need to be streamlined a little bit and also maybe prioritized a bit differently as well. Currently, you could argue that they're maybe a bit small. It would be nice to have some UI tinkerings to be done. If I could maybe bring them to the left-hand side of the screen where there's literally nothing and then make them much larger, 3-4 times bigger. If they're red alerts in particular, that could be very useful. And otherwise, I think that overall, the UI and the user experience interface could probably use with some extra, at the very least, accessibility functions, if not more. I expect we'll see more and more use of things like hotkeys as well moving through, and that will potentially help to free up any unnecessary clutter or accessibility difficulties within the UI itself. Again, just to reiterate though, overall, not bad at all. In fact, overall, pretty dang good. And that concludes this video on 5 things that I think Dune Spice Wars must do to hold its momentum and surge through and become a really fantastic release building on its early access. Absolutely fantastic and joyous times. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. But before then, do comment below if you'd like to share anything. I say this not to feed the algorithm comments, but genuinely because the feedback on these videos is always very useful and sometimes gets noticed by people in powerful places. Thanks for watching. See you next time.